But ChatGPT, GPT-3, all these systems are, fueled by a collective imagination, a collective consciousness. They're full of tons of experiences and millions of personal stories. And so when you're tapping into these systems, it's not just like going back to your own memory bank. You're getting access to millions of people's ideas and thoughts and creative impulses. And that can be good and that can be bad. Like, you can also tap into some of the darker sides of what's in the training data. But it also means you have access to things that are outside your own experience, which I also think is, creatively, that's very interesting, and conceptually that's very interesting, but also culturally and socially, especially at a time when, like, we're experiencing so many divisions and, political disdain and all that. Like, I think it's really interesting to think about the fact that, as you mentioned, we all now have access to kind of like a universal brain in a way.
I'm excited to welcome Sasha Stiles, a sought-after creative partner for game-changing brands and agencies. Sasha is a multi-talented individual who combines her passions for poetry, art, and technology. As a metapoet, literary artist, and AI researcher, Sasha's work explores the intersection of human creativity and machine imagination. She's also the co-founder of theVERSEverse, a poetry NFT gallery that showcases the limitless potential of language and technology. With a magna cum laude degree from Harvard College and a Master's of Studies in Literature from Oxford University, Sasha brings a unique perspective to the world of art and technology. Today, we'll dive into Sasha's book, Technelegy, theVERSEverse, and explore her thoughts on literary NFTs, AI natural language processing, generative text, art, and the future of literature and publishing. Hey, Sasha, welcome on this episode.
Oh, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. It's so nice to be here. Really looking forward to having our chat today, and appreciate those lovely words to kick us off.
Yeah, amazing. I know I said a bit about you, but I'm super curious to hear a bit more about your background and experiences and how I'd say you kind of got into the Web3 space. I'm always curious to hear the stories.
It's definitely a bit of a twisting, turning path, for sure. Well, as you might expect, just from some of what you were just talking us through, my background is mainly in literature and language. I do a lot of work now with AI and, with digital technologies, but I actually have a pretty analog background when it comes to writing. I'm a lifelong writer. I'm a lifelong poet. I grew up, just devouring books when I was little and just loving poetry. And just from a young age, it's kind of how I've gravitated towards processing the world around me. And I love playing with words and with language. And at the same time, I'm also very interested in science and technology. And that's always been sort of an undercurrent of my work as well, and my interest since I was very young. I actually grew up in a household that was very interested in science and technology. My parents are documentary filmmakers who focus on the sciences in different ways. And so I think I came to appreciate the way that science and art, kind of complement each other, and actually, rather than sort of being two kind of different things, two kind of antithetical things, they really are both modes of creative exploration. And I think I really sort of internalized that from a very young age. So a lot of my poetry and a lot of my writing has always been about sort of, maybe not necessarily scientific inquiry, but about technological sort of exploration, and about thinking about our relationship to various modes of technology, and kind of thinking about the engineering and the scientific advances that underpin that. So, I was born kind of into the age of the rise of the personal computer and things like that. And, like I said, I grew up as a very analog child, and, it was kind of funny because, I have that experience on the one hand, but then as I got older, You know, I think the smartphone came about like when I was, you know, a graduate student. So that was pretty late in the game, right? And I really remember, you know, distinctly having a very kind of offline experience growing up. And then now, as so many of us are, being completely immersed in this world of digital technologies on a daily basis, I really have thought quite a lot over the years about what that means, you know, to me and to the way my mind works and to how I interact with the world around me. And so a lot of the work I do is, I think, in some way an attempt to kind of consider what it means to be a human in this moment when humanity is, you know, being kind of merged together with our technologies in many ways, both very obvious and also ways that are so subtle that we might not even be noticing them. So that's all kind of a background in, you know, I guess like how I got interested in writing technology on these, or writing poetry about these themes of technology. But then, you know, as to your question about getting into the Web3 space, you know, I had been writing a lot of these poems, writing a lot about all these themes that I just mentioned in very traditional and conventional formats. You know, I was writing poems and then submitting them to traditional literary journals and, you know, publishing on the printed page. And at some point, I think it kind of struck me that I was writing about things like digital immortality and artificial wombs and neural implants and, you know, all sorts of things that I think hint at like what our technologies are capable of. And at the same time, I was using this rather archaic technology of printing words on a static piece of paper. And so I began to really wonder what would happen if if I took that language into three-dimensional or four-dimensional space, or if I was able to sort of think about what it would mean to write a poem and publish a poem, not with the intention of doing so on a piece of paper or even on a computer screen or on a website page, but if I could, you know, publish a poem as an experience, what would that be? And that really kind of got me thinking, you know, more in the area of digital art and new media, and really kind of experimenting with various tools to turn my writing into text-based sort of multimedia, multidimensional, multisensorial texts, you know. So they're still text, but they're texts in very different ways. And of course, like that, you know, that's been really, really fun for me to do, but it's also been kind of hard for me to reconcile how that sits with the literary establishment, right? Because it's still quite unclear how some of these experiments might be able to fit between the covers of a book, for example. So, you know, I'd been sort of casting about, trying to think of what was the right way to not just, you know, not just make these pieces, but publish them and share them and help them find readers. And when I learned about the blockchain, and this was at the end of 2020 when I really started to get into it, I saw all these amazing artists who were, you know, using Web3, using NFT technology to share their work. And it occurred to me that this was a perfect fit for the kind of work that I'd been doing and that I didn't really have a venue for. And I just immediately dove right in and realized that as exciting as it was for artists, that it could be an equally exciting and empowering and inspiring place for writers as well. And so I've been, you know, continuing a lot of my offline practices and my physical practices, but at the same time, really throwing myself deep into this question of what the future of literature and language might be, both on the blockchain and in the metaverse and in virtual realms.
I'd say very insightful, everything you've said, and you have quite a great portfolio, very inspiring one. And I'm curious to know, like, the role of poetry and literary NFTs, like in the growing Web3 and decentralized culture. Like, how do you see this intersecting with the, you know, with the art world and technology?
Yeah, well, like I said, when I first kind of got immersed in this space, I sort of understood right away that there was enormous potential for writers like me, not just writers who are, you know, making digital work or multimedia work, but all sorts of writing. I mean, blockchain represents a really interesting opportunity for self-publishing and self-distribution, right? So that's something that, of course, like has existed for a long time, but for any writer, I think being able to have autonomy over how you publish something and how you find readership, and then also, how you are compensated for your work as a writer. These are all really important things that, I think blockchain definitely represents a lot of great possibilities for. That being said, when I first landed in this space, there really weren't many, if any, platforms dedicated to writing. There were a lot of art platforms, a lot of art marketplaces, but they started to kind of look around, and there weren't very many other writers in the space at that time, in like late 2020, early 2021, but there were some. And I think we all kind of started gravitating towards each other a little bit, because there weren't many of us, and we were like, we got to talk to other people who were doing something similar. And I think we realized that, there was, again, like there was real potential in figuring out ways that that publishing via the blockchain could sort of unlock new possibilities for what language can do and for how language can reach readers. I think that, poetry in particular, I won't like generalize too broadly about literature as a whole, but with poetry in particular, poetry is considered, I think, widely like a very old-fashioned form of art, right? A little bit inaccessible. Maybe some people find it a little intimidating. Poetry books are not usually on the bestseller list. I think, in general, I feel like we all sort of appreciate at a base level, like the inherent value of poetry, because when there's important moments in our lives, we tend to reach for poems, and we like recite poems at weddings and at funerals and at moments, like the inauguration when Amanda Gorman like delivered her beautiful poem some years ago. Like those are moments where we recognize how important poetry is and can be. But on a daily basis, I think a lot of people, unless they're like in school reading the Norton Anthology of Poetry or something like that, they're not reading poetry. And so I think, one of the things that seemed so exciting was that this could be a way to bring poetry a little bit more into popular culture, and to help it find new modes of expression, and to help it find new readership, and kind of push back against this idea that poetry is like old-fashioned and doesn't have any relevance to modern life. And that's a combination of bringing it into the places where we're already like spending our time. So like bringing poetry onto your phone, onto your computer, onto your laptop, into the blockchain, into Twitter, into places where you might not think to find poetry. And it also just, I think, has to do with really sort of opening up the idea of what poetry is or what it should be. Like it doesn't have to be something that fits in the pages of a literary journal. It doesn't have to look a certain way or sound a certain way. And that's something that I think can break down some of these perceived barriers to poetry. If someone's intimidated by reading poems in a certain form, then maybe they'd like to watch a video poem instead, or play a game that is actually a gamified piece of poetry. There are all these really interesting possibilities to sort of take poetic language and poetic ideas and kind of adapt them and turn them into different objects and experiences that people can like really relate to on a very personal level. So I think there's something really, really exciting about that, and really, really, worth pursuing, which is why I and two other writers at the end of 2021 co-founded theVERSEverse, which you mentioned in your intro. And as you said, theVERSEverse it's a poetry gallery that is dedicated to what can be done on the blockchain. So we're really focused on creating sort of a central is not the right word probably in Web3, but creating kind of like a really exciting destination for writers who are curious to learn where they might be able to take their practice using some of these new tools. And the idea is to kind of break down the barriers, to kind of like remove that intimidation factor, to help onboard writers if they're curious, and to kind of showcase the depth and the breadth of the kind of work that's being done in the literary world online, and not just online, but in Web3, because I think still the majority of attention is on crypto art. And we're really trying to not just like create a platform to showcase writing, but to really almost like spearhead a bit of a movement to say writers belong here too, and storytelling belongs here too. Short stories, novels, poetry, playwriting, like all forms of literature can really come to life on the blockchain in some very exciting ways. And I think that's really the core mission that we have, is to kind of show, to show that there really are no limits, and there's so many really exciting directions, and we've seen a lot of very cool projects take off in the VERSEverse and also kind of around the VERSEverse in the broader community.
Yeah, that's totally important, and I like that you're doing this work, because I think a couple of months ago we had Anna on. I think she's a founder, and it was
Anna Maria Caballero. Yep.
Yes, we had her as a guest on NEWFORUM, and it was really special talking to her, because that was the very first time I even heard about the poetry and technology. Like, it was like so far off, right? So I'm super curious to kind of like take the conversation to the AI side of things. Yeah. Because you're working in that field, you're a researcher and everything. So can you give us maybe an overview of your research in this area and how you believe it will impact the future of language and communication?
I love this topic. Yeah, well, I've been working with AI, large language models, since about 2018. And like I said before, I don't have a technical background, but I have been really interested for probably about a decade now, maybe a little bit less, but I've been interested for a long time now in computational poetry, specifically what's possible with some of these new advances with artificial intelligence, and specifically with sort of a subset of AI called natural language processing. And natural language processing, just to kind of like set the foundation for this, is basically an area that brings together AI and linguistics and computer science, and it kind of like pulls them all together. And essentially, it's an area that's interested in taking intelligent systems and training them on, big quantities of data, and in this case, written text. So, potentially sourcing text from, millions of web pages, or in some cases, it might be training among all the works of William Shakespeare or something like that. But training a model on a particular set of written texts, and then using neural networks, using AI powered systems to sift through all that information, to kind of absorb it, to process it, to analyze it, and then to synthesize it. So basically, these models are learning from studying these examples how we humans put language together. So it's looking at everything and analyzing all the patterns and how sentences are constructed, or how certain words are used in different contexts. And it's kind of at a very vast scale, it's understanding grammar and syntax and spelling and all the things that we need to know in order to assemble language and communicate the way that we're communicating right now. So I've been very interested in that kind of as a baseline to a lot of my own work as a writer. I've spent countless years studying how to write and how to craft language, and learning about, poetic syntax and poetic devices and things like that. So I'm very interested in this idea that just as we sort of train ourselves to be writers and communicators, we can also train intelligent systems in a very similar way. And then on top of that, I've been extremely interested in how to take that a step further and not just use these large language models as is, but to kind of layer on additional training and additional fine-tuning is kind of the technical term for it, fine-tuning, layer in additional information and examples so that the large language model learns to write not just, like a generic human, but learns to write in a particular style, or learns to write in a particular way, or using certain syntax or vocabulary or poetic style. And so what I've done is, and this is something I've been working on for about 5 years now, is customizing text generators. So taking first it was GPT-2, now it's GPT-3 and almost GPT-4, but using these large language models that were sort of the basis for ChatGPT, and giving them sort of a one-on-one poetry mentorship. So coming in and kind of training them in how I want them to write, and basically how I want them to write is more like me. So I will use bespoke training data sets that are rooted in my writing and in my research notes and in all the materials and information that I would use as a human writer to write a book. I'm now putting those into a training data set and teaching them to, for example, GPT-3, and then using that model, using prompts and kind of back and forth work sessions to generate text. And then, I can also take that text and then do other things with it. So it kind of becomes a little bit of a back and forth where the text generator is the writer and I'm kind of the editor in a way. But it's been a really exciting area. And like I said, I started a while ago, and when I began, really there wasn't very much happening in the poetry community at all with this kind of generative text. And really like not very much interest, quite frankly, from a lot of the people that I was showing these things to, back in 2018, 19. So it's been pretty wild watching what's happened in a span of literally months with ChatGPT. And as you say, like, it's really exciting because these kinds of tools don't require coding. They don't require a lot of technical knowledge at all. I think, it really is going to, and is already it's already accomplishing this. It's really introducing a lot of people to the power of AI systems to help us become better communicators and to help us express things that we might otherwise struggle to express. So I think it's a really important area for innovation. And I think, right now, a lot of these tools are being, built specifically for business purposes, for B2B, for commercial uses and all that. So I'm very, happy to see more and more writers, more and more creatives using not only tools like ChatGPT, but also, tools like DALL-E and Midjourney and other, text to image tools as well. Because I think on the one hand, it really is exciting to kind of crack open the human imagination and see what's possible in combination with a machine mind, but also because we know that these AI systems they're really setting the foundations for a lot of what's going to be happening in the future. And I think it's really important for us, even if we're not all coders and engineers and all that, it's important to know how they work. It's important to know how they're trained, what they're trained on, what their biases might be. Even I think, through something like ChatGPT being in the news, it's introducing more people to the nuances of how these systems are created and why it's so important to do so responsibly and ethically.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I really think that OpenAI definitely deserves a ton of credit, of giving access to like a cognitive kind of intelligence as an open API. I think that's really cool. And you posted on your LinkedIn as well as Twitter, and you said, may I suggest hashtag Technelegy. So this is your book. I've been writing AI-powered large language models since 2018, and this book, one of the first works of literature to use these tools, reflects the intersection of human creativity and machine imagination. So I'm wondering, like, can you talk about, your experience writing with perhaps AI-powered language models and how it has like influenced your creative process and the writing of your book?
Oh, no, that's great. Well, thank you for asking about all that. I mean, it's definitely a really interesting area. And I mean, honestly, 10 years ago, as an analog poet, I never would have thought to go in this direction. So it's been really wild. I think for me, the most exciting part about it is the fact that I, as a writer, and I would assume you probably feel this way too, and like most writers do, like we're as much as writing is a creative act, like we all are sort of taught, over time, like how to write, like what is good writing? What are the rules that we need to follow? What are good subjects for a poem? Like what can you do? What can't you do? Like we have all these rules and sort of like regulations, and obviously, you know, we can break them, but I think there's this set sort of idea in our head about like what we should and what we shouldn't be doing. And what's really exciting for me in using tools like GPT-3, and, you know, of course, like again, ChatGPT is sort of is a kind of a version like of ChatGPT-3, of GPT-3. What's really exciting about that is that you're able to sort of combine what your impulses are as, you know, a human creative creature with a system that is also programmed with lots of rules that we're embedded with, but doesn't necessarily have all the sort of inhibitions or preconceived notions about what we should and shouldn't do. And so, or at least like for me, that's been my experience, is that I will, you know, if I'm writing a poem on my own, I might think to myself, oh, I can't do that. You know, I can't like change this and use this word because that's not really a word I would normally use. Or, you know, this might sound kind of strange, or, you know, I can't play with this kind of weird punctuation experimentation because that feels, uh, for whatever reason, doesn't feel like it fits here. So I have all these self-censoring, like self-editing mechanisms. And I think what's been fun is writing in collaboration with the machine. The machine will like just put out all sorts of crazy things, like all sorts of really wild experiments. It's not censoring itself. It's just kind of, you know, that's what it's meant to do, is to churn out tons of information, right? So it's putting out things that I probably would never have written myself because I'm just automatically thinking I can't do that, I can't do that, I can't do that. You know, the machine's doing that. And every so often, you know, I'll look at it and say, that's wonderful. Like I wouldn't have done that myself, but it makes total sense in the context of what I'm working on. And like, that's a direction that I want to go in. So it kind of cracks open my own imagination and helps me be braver and more courageous as a writer, and take bolder risks, I think, in my writing. And that's been great. It's been very liberating and been very, it's been very freeing to kind of to write in this sort of third voice that is a mixture of my voice and the machine's voice. Like we're kind of merging to this, I don't know, this like transhuman style that can do a lot of the things that I might not have done on my own. And it's taking me into new places, taking me into new areas that I think are really worth exploring. But again, that I might not have gotten to otherwise. And I think just the last thing I'll say about that is one of the reasons why is because, you know, my imagination, my human brain is full of my experience, right? But ChatGPT, GPT-3, all these systems are, you know, fueled by a collective imagination, a collective consciousness. They're full of tons of experiences and millions of personal stories. And so when you're tapping into these systems, it's not just like going back to your own memory bank. You're getting access to millions of people's ideas and thoughts and creative impulses. And that can be good and that can be bad. Like you can also tap into some of the darker sides of what's in the training data. But it also means you have access to things that are outside your own experience, which I also think is, you know, creatively, that's very interesting. And conceptually, that's very interesting, but also culturally and socially, especially at a time when like we're experiencing so many divisions and, you know, political disdain and all that. Like, I think it's really interesting to think about the fact that, as you mentioned, we all now have access to kind of like a universal brain in a way.
That's a good way to think about it. I feel like AI has evolved from just capturing information to actually producing information, like as we're seeing it now. But the only thing is, it's almost like it's this black box of information. And like you said, you know, different minds, which is a positive thing. But I'm usually curious to know, like, what's the source, right? Like, where is this information coming from? And then sometimes this idea of, can I say it's my work? The ethical side of things, can I say it's my work because, you know, I put the prompts? Like,
yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting topic too, and that's obviously been kind of a big point of debate, especially in like the visual art community, and looking at how models like DALL-E and Midjourney and all those are trained. I think, you know, one of the things that I have referenced quite a lot recently is the idea of literary canon. So thinking about how we as writers how we find our inspiration. None of us is writing in a vacuum, right? Like we're referencing texts that have been written and passed down through the generations. We all kind of are tapping into a shared canon of literature that influences, what we think about and how we shape narratives and how we develop characters and how we write poems. And obviously there's variations in that, from person to person and from culture to culture, but in general, like we're all kind of using that kind of a system already, like even predating AI. And I really love the poet T.S. Eliot. He's one of my favorite writers, and he wrote an essay called Tradition and the Individual Talent, which is kind of actually all about this idea that as a writer, as a creative person, your ideas are not your own. Your ideas are inspired by by everyone who's come before you. And he actually wrote something along the lines of, when you write, you should be writing, or you are writing as though you have like all the writers, throughout history in your bones and in your blood. And obviously he was writing that, not referring at all to AI, but I can't help think of that in relationship to this question, because I think that is true. It's like we have this myth of originality as creative people, like as artists and writers. We want to think that like, this is my idea, but like the fact is we're all constantly getting inspired and getting influenced by everything that's happening around us. And I think that definitely is something to keep in mind, like with this conversation. I think when it comes to tactical issues like copyright and like plagiarism, those are maybe slightly distinct kind of subsets of the conversation. And there are definitely weird moments where, there are things that come out of a generator that are verbatim, like taken from another text, lots of ways to be passing that off as your own. But, even there's this whole kind of history of appropriation art and of found poetry and of found objects, and it comes down to context, right? It's like how you're using something and what kind of, what kind of project you're integrating it into. It's one thing to kind of to have a text generator write a college essay and for that to be verbatim ripping off someone else's work, but it's another thing for an appropriation artist to be kind of riffing on the history of art to kind of use or reference canonical works in some way. So I feel like, again, it's a little bit of a spectrum. It kind of depends a little bit on how you're using them.
Do you have any like favorite projects or pieces that you've created, and maybe in the context of Web3, decentralized culture, or just anything at all?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a few that I've really been thinking about a lot lately. I have some upcoming things, but just to name a few recent ones that I have really enjoyed making. One was actually a poem from the book, from Technelegy, and it was one of the first AI generated poems that I kind of wrote and knew was going to be part of the book. And it's sort of like a first person poem that kind of has to do with what it means or what it feels like to be a machine that's sort of built to outlast your creator. That's kind of the overall theme of the poem. And it started with, I had a couple lines for a poem in my head, like just that I had written, and I couldn't figure out like what I was going to do with the poem. I wasn't sure where it was going to go. So I just kind of like had those lines like on a piece of paper somewhere. And this poem started with those lines as a prompt, and then using my custom generator, I like asked the generator to complete the poem. And it became this like long kind of beautiful, like poetic manifesto about digital loneliness and about like the desire to like forge connection and have a relationship with other beings. And anyway, so it's this poem called Completion, When It's Just You. And it was first published in my book. So, very much like in a traditional way, just printed like on paper. And at the same time, I really wanted to think more about like what else I could do with this poem, because it really has meant a lot to me and I think about it a lot. And last year, I was able to adapt it into a 3-minute video that has visualizations. I do a lot of animation and motion graphics and things like that. So it has sort of, it's kind of next gen moving type, but then it's also it's got voiceover. So I've performed the poem as a spoken word piece, and then there's also electronic enhancements and sound design. So it's become this like multimedia kind of poetic performance. And I was able to publish that on the blockchain, in a way that I wouldn't have been able to do, like, in like the Kenyan Review or whatever literary journal. So being able to actually publish that and share that with people via blockchain was great. And I got to exhibit it a few different places last year. And it was even brought up at auction at Christie's at the end of the year and sold to a really amazing collector. Or a group of collectors. So that was a really exciting thing to see a poem go from my book, from this static printed object, and like become this 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional piece that is now kind of like living in galleries and museums and on the blockchain. And like the fact that it gets to have a life beyond the book itself is really meaningful to me. So that's a very special one. I've also been working on some generative poetry projects with a creative coder named Nathaniel Stern. He's also a wonderful artist, and we share a lot of overlapping interests. And we've been working together to think about how we can use generative platforms like FX Hash, like art blocks, engines that are really like built to create and produce generative art, how we can use that to produce long form algorithmic poetry. So had a few collections last year that we launched on FX Hash, which are also really, they were really fun to work on and really exciting to kind of see, again, this merger of human kind of our human creative intention, and then to see how a generative algorithm interprets it and creates something that is like both very familiar to what we envisioned, but also kind of takes on a life of its own. So those projects were one was called the word after us on FX Hash, and the other one was a series called Oral Binary, which is kind of an audio visual generative piece.
Sounds like you really had a lot of fun creating these. I would totally check them out. So like back to the whole AI topic, right? What was the process of you, like when you were collaborating with the AI? Like I think it kind of like is kind of influencing our creative minds and the way we think, the way we work. And so like, do you think it's going to be like replacing a lot of work? Do we have to worry about it? Are we going to be just thinking differently? Should there be courses about like, AI in schools? Like, any thoughts about that?
So I kind of think a little bit about, AI in the context of lots of other technological innovations that help us be more efficient and to do more. So, for example, I sometimes think to myself, like, I don't walk everywhere. I get in my car and drive because it's it's an invention and innovation that enables me to do more. And I think there's something to be said for AI kind of in that in that analogy as well, that AI, especially these language tools, can enable us to maybe say more precisely what we mean to say, or to communicate more clearly to other people. AI powered translators can enable a lot of communication that we're not able to have right now. There's like lots of different ways in which it can turbocharge our connections to each other. Like fundamentally, what it means to be human is about like how we relate to other humans and how we communicate and how we share, our ideas and our beliefs and our desires and all that. So any technology that really is about helping us do that better, I think has a lot of potential, which is why I'm like personally so, invested in it and so excited to kind of see where this can go. I think there's a lot of media hype about this danger of, outsourcing our creativity or outsourcing our brain, or is this going to make us all lazy, or mean that we're not going to know how to write and all that.
As you're speaking, I'm just thinking about how important it is for people to actually hear you speak about AI in this manner, because like you said, there are all these ideas about AI taking over humanity and all kinds of crazy stuff. And I think that this idea of it enhancing our experience is super important. But what would you tell anyone watching you or listening to you who is on the other side of things and scared and worried and yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that a lot of my work, I really consider that I'm not outsourcing things to an AI. I'm really collaborating with an AI, right? And the result is that there's some sort of connection that's enabling me to do something that I couldn't do on my own. But at the same time, I recognize that the AI can't do what I do without my contributions as well. So I think for me, I'm very invested in the idea of human machine collaboration and in the way that we can really work together with it. We can, really like tackle a lot of the difficult problems and solve many of the difficult challenges that we humans are facing right now. I think, when I hear people kind of talk about being so frightened about advances like AI, I sometimes think to myself, and I don't mean this to sound flippant, but I'm like, do we think that this is as good as humanity gets? Like if we look around and we see all the things that are happening around the world and devastations of climate catastrophes and all these difficult problems that we're facing, in all corners of the globe, I think it's really interesting to look at the potential for AI as an augmented imagination to help us start to solve some of the problems that we haven't been able to, to tackle ourselves. And I think there's enormous potential for AI to sort of help us, realize that there's more than kind of what we're programmed to think. There's potentially more ways forward than we can imagine. And if we task a machine mind that is trained to like come up with ideas and come up with lots of different ways forward, I think that there's huge potential for that to be beneficial, rather than detrimental. But it all depends on how things are used, how they're evolved, how they're trained, and of course, like ultimately, it comes down to how they're prompted and like how that human machine interaction actually occurs.
So I guess like the person training it is really crucial in this in a way, because it's a tool, right? And it can be used for good, but it can also be used to cause damage, I say. And so I think it's really important that we use it to enhance human experience versus trying to do anything other than that. And so I think that's quite important, because you're using it to, like you said, it's a collaboration, right? And I think of you and I, we're having some form of collaboration, and that's fine, right? So it makes sense, right? But it all depends on the individual who is handling it. So I think that's something that we should also kind of be aware, not to be sort of pushing at the how do you say, the technology itself, but more like the people, because it's all about us. Like we are powering everything, so it's kind of what we feed it. So
yeah, I think that's why it's important for artists, in particular artists and writers and creative people, to engage with these tools, because oftentimes it's up to non-engineers and non-developers and non-business people. Like it's up to the creators to kind of, to the creatives, to really kind of look at what the limits are of these systems, and also to think about like how they might be used outside the purpose for which they're built. So I think that's, again, it's nice that we have AI so that we can like make interesting images and write interesting poems and stuff. But I also feel like it's really important for so many of us to be engaging with the tools for precisely the reason you said, which is to learn more about how they work and why they do what they do, and then to also kind of think, well, what else can we use them for beyond the obvious?
right. That's perfectly said. And Sasha, I don't know if you have any maybe last thoughts, anything you want to highlight to our community before I let you go, which is hard too, but yeah.
No, that I think this has been really fun, and it's a lot to talk about. I mean, like any one of these topics alone, like generative literature, Web3, like all these things they're so fascinating. So it's always hard to really, like do justice to everything in a short period of time. But I thank you so much for your questions, and it's been really fun chatting with you.
It's been fun. So where can we find you on your social platforms?
Yeah, well, it's pretty easy. I'm just at Sasha Stiles, like across the board on, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, everything. And then you can follow theVERSEverse too for anyone who's interested in what we're up to there. It's just at theVERSEverse on Instagram and Twitter. And, as I said before, we're really focused on showcasing various examples of literary NFTs, but we're also very engaged in a lot of community dialogue about the future of publishing and about, what's next for literature and for language. So it's definitely a fun conversation to jump in and be part of.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sasha, and thank you all for participating in today's forum. If you want to get more involved in our community, make sure to follow us on our social platform. And we are NEWFORUM_NCO on Twitter. And we will have all the links in the description below. And thank you again. And I will see you in the next episode.